Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. Somewhere around 5,000 years ago, in the land between two rivers, scribes sat cross-legged in dim temple chambers, their reed styluses poised above soft tablets of river mud, and they began to record stories that were already ancient beyond reckoning, tales passed down through countless generations of whispered tradition, accounts of what existed before existence itself had a name, and these stories speak of a cosmos so primordial that even the gods we might recognize had not yet drawn breath, a universe of swirling darkness and endless water, where nothing solid had ever formed and nothing living had ever stirred. And if you find yourself growing drowsy as we explore these impossibly distant memories together, well, that is precisely the point, because these are the kinds of stories meant to be absorbed in that gentle space between waking and sleeping, where the mind opens like a lotus flower to receive mysteries it cannot fully comprehend in the harsh light of day. The Sumerian civilization, which flourished in what is now southern Iraq, left behind hundreds of thousands of clay tablets covered in their distinctive cuneiform script, and among these archaeological treasures are creation narratives that describe with surprising consistency what the universe looked like before the great gods established order, before the Anunnaki assembled in their divine council, before heaven and earth were separated like cosmic curtains being drawn apart. And these are the stories we shall explore tonight. Though I should warn you that the journey will take us through realms of profound strangeness, through waters that have no bottom, and darkness that has no end, and you probably won't survive this, at least not as a fully awake person, because by the time we reach the end of our tale, you will almost certainly have surrendered to the warm embrace of sleep, which is honestly the best possible outcome for both of us. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because there is something wonderfully fitting about showing appreciation for a story about primordial creation by performing a small creative act of your own, pressing that button, making something happen in the digital void. It is not so different from the ancient scribes pressing their styluses into wet clay to preserve these exact narratives for future generations, though I suspect they never imagined their work would one day help strangers fall asleep, which is perhaps the most peaceful legacy any writer could hope for. If you would like to share where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world, please do leave a comment, because there is something deeply comforting about knowing that people across every time zone are drifting off to these same ancient words, that someone in Tokyo, and someone in Toronto, and someone in a tiny village whose name I could not pronounce, are all simultaneously sinking into pillows while contemplating the chaos before creation. It creates a kind of global lullaby community that would have seemed like absolute magic to our Sumerian ancestors, though they believed in plenty of magic already. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because the story we are about to explore begins in a place where light had never existed and sound had never traveled, and the very concepts of beginning and ending had not yet been invented by anyone, divine or otherwise. The mainstream scholarly consensus, established through decades of careful translation work by Assyriology researchers at institutions from Yale to Berlin to Baghdad, tells us that Sumerian cosmogony began with the concept of the primordial sea, and this is not metaphorical oceanic imagery like we might find in later Greek philosophy. This is a literal description of what the Sumerians believed existed before anything else, an infinite expanse of water without surface or floor, without temperature or motion, without any quality we could describe except wetness and endlessness. And the name they gave to this primordial water was Namu, though calling her by a name already begins to impose a structure that did not yet exist in that formless beginning, because Namu was not a goddess in the way we might imagine goddesses, with temples and priests and festivals. She was the water itself, the original everything and nothing, simultaneously, and scholars like Thorkild Jacobson and Samuel Noah Kramer spent their careers attempting to understand what this concept meant to the people who first articulated it, concluding that Namu represented something closer to a state of being than a personality, though she would eventually give birth to everything that has personality, which is quite an impressive maternal accomplishment when you think about it, sort of like being the great-great-grandmother of literally every atom in the universe, though I doubt she ever received a proper Mother's Day card. Now here is where things get deliciously weird, because alongside the mainstream interpretations, there exist certain fringe theories about what Namu and the primordial waters might represent, and while I present these with appropriate scholarly skepticism, they are too fascinating to ignore entirely. Particularly the notion proposed by some alternative historians that the Sumerian descriptions of the watery void might encode actual memories of pre-human geological events, perhaps the flooding of the Persian Gulf Basin at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, when melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise dramatically and swallowed vast tracts of previously habitable land. And while professional archaeologists generally roll their eyes at such interpretations, which tend to appear in documentaries with dramatic music and suspicious narrator voices, there is something almost irresistible about imagining that these creation myths might contain genuine echoes of environmental catastrophe, that the endless waters of Namu might be a cultural memory of waters that literally seemed endless to the traumatized survivors watching their world disappear beneath the waves. And whether or not this interpretation holds any historical validity, it certainly adds a layer of poignancy to the mythology, though personally I think the Sumerians were capable of imagining infinity without needing to have experienced a flood first, because human beings have always been remarkably good at contemplating the incomprehensible, which is why we invented philosophy and astronomy and late-night conversations about whether the universe has an edge. The scholarly debate about how to properly understand Namu and the primordial waters has occupied academic journals for generations, with some researchers arguing that Namu represents an older, possibly matriarchal religious tradition that was later overlaid by the male-dominated Anunnaki pantheon, while others contend that reading gender politics into ancient Mesopotamian mythology imposes modern frameworks onto cultures that understood divinity in fundamentally different ways, and still others suggest that Namu was never worshipped as a goddess at all, but functioned purely as a cosmological concept, a way of answering the unanswerable question of what existed before existence. And this debate remains unresolved because the clay tablets themselves offer contradictory evidence, with some texts treating Namu as an active creative force, and others barely mentioning her at all, which is frankly typical of ancient religious documents that were written across centuries by different scribes with different theological agendas, sort of like trying to reconstruct Christian theology by reading randomly selected passages from different centuries of church history. You would end up with a somewhat confusing picture, even though all the texts theoretically describe the same religion. Picture yourself now in one of those temple chambers where these stories were first written down. The room illuminated only by oil lamps, whose flames dance in the draft from small windows set high in mud brick walls, the air thick with the smell of clay and vegetable oil and human concentration, the scribe working with careful deliberation, because each mark he makes will last for millennia, if properly fired and stored, and he is recording words that already feel impossibly old to him, words his teachers learned from their teachers, who learned from their teachers, in an unbroken chain, stretching back into the mists of oral tradition, and the story he tells describes a cosmos before cosmos, a time before time, when the universe was nothing but water, and the water was nothing but potential, containing within itself every possibility that would ever exist but manifesting none of them yet, like an infinitely patient seed waiting for conditions that had not yet been created because the conditions themselves were part of what the seed would eventually become, which is the kind of circular logic that makes creation myths so beautifully impossible to fully grasp. Though perhaps that is the point. Perhaps these stories were always meant to be felt rather than understood, absorbed into the drowsy mind like water soaking into clay, changing the shape of consciousness in ways too subtle to articulate. And if you find your thoughts beginning to blur at the edges as you contemplate the primordial waters, if the distinction between yourself and the story starts to dissolve like salt in an endless sea, well, that means the magic is working exactly as intended. The temples where these stories were preserved were called ziggurats, stepped pyramids of mud brick rising from the flat Mesopotamian plain, like artificial mountains, and they served not only as religious centers, but as schools where scribes learned their craft over years of rigorous training, and one can imagine young students yawning through lessons about Namu and the primordial chaos, struggling to stay awake, just as you might be struggling now, though for them the consequence of nodding off was probably a sharp rebuke from their teacher, rather than the gentle reward of restful sleep, which makes your situation considerably more pleasant than theirs. So perhaps take a moment to appreciate the luxury of learning these ancient tales, while lying comfortably in bed, free from the obligation to transcribe them onto clay tablets in the morning, free from any requirement except to drift and dream, and let the words carry you wherever they wish to go. The primordial waters did not remain empty forever, because even infinite potential eventually becomes restless, and from the formless depths of Namu there emerged the first stirrings of structure, the first differentiation between one thing and another thing, the birth of separation, which is really the birth of everything. And this is where our story begins to populate itself, with characters who feel more recognizably divine, though calling them characters almost diminishes the cosmic scale of what they represent. These are not gods who worry about human prayers, or temple offerings, or proper sacrifice procedures. These are the fundamental forces of existence itself, putting on names and faces for the first time, trying out the novel experience of being something rather than nothing. The Sumerian texts describe how from Namu emerged Anunnaki, heaven and earth, though at this earliest stage they were not yet separated. They clung together in what scholars sometimes describe as a cosmic embrace, the sky pressing down upon the land like two lovers who cannot bear to be parted. And this image of the primordial heaven-earth conjunction appears in creation mythologies around the world, from the Greek Uranus and Gaia, to the Egyptian Nut and Geb, to the Maori Rangi and Papa, which either suggests some deep psychological truth about how human beings conceptualize the origin of duality, or indicates that ancient peoples were all working from similar environmental observations about the apparent meeting of earth and sky at the horizon, or perhaps demonstrates that there are only so many ways to imagine how twoness emerged from oneness. And frankly, any of these explanations works equally well as a bedtime theory, though the coincidence is striking enough that someone should probably write a comparative mythology dissertation about it, assuming someone has not already written 12. Here is a mainstream Sumerian historical fact that anchors this mythological narrative in actual archaeological evidence. The divine pair Ain and Ki, along with their emerging family of younger deities, appear in temple inscriptions dating back to at least the early dynastic period around 2700 BCE, and the consistency of their portrayal across different Sumerian city-states suggests that this theological framework was already well established by the time writing became sophisticated enough to record it properly, which means the oral traditions underlying these texts must be older still, stretching back perhaps into the 4th millennium BCE, when the earliest Sumerian settlements were taking shape along the banks of the Euphrates, and some researchers have even argued that elements of Sumerian mythology might preserve cultural memories from the Ubaid period, a pre-Sumerian archaeological culture that flourished in southern Mesopotamia as early as 6500 BCE, though this remains speculative, and is the kind of claim that makes conservative Assyriologists uncomfortable, which is usually a sign that the claim is either revolutionary or nonsense, with the line between those categories being frustratingly thin. The family tree that emerges from An and Ki becomes rather complicated rather quickly, because ancient Mesopotamian mythology was never terribly concerned with logical consistency. Different cities had different favorite gods and different versions of how everyone was related to everyone else, and trying to construct a single coherent genealogy from the various surviving texts is like trying to reconstruct a family tree from contradictory gossip. You end up with gods who are simultaneously each other's parents and children and siblings, which sounds impossible until you remember that these are cosmic entities operating outside normal space and time, and causality works differently when you are a fundamental force of existence, or at least that is the excuse I would use if I were an ancient theologian trying to reconcile contradictory temple traditions, though honestly the Sumerians seem not to have been particularly bothered by the inconsistencies, perhaps because they understood that mythology operates by dream logic rather than waking logic, and in dreams things can be two contradictory things simultaneously without causing any problems whatsoever. Among the children of the primordial union were Enlil, the god of air and wind and breath, and it is Enlil who would eventually become the chief executive deity of the Sumerian pantheon, the king of the gods, the one who assigns fates and issues decrees, but at this early stage of cosmic history, he is merely potential waiting to actualize, a divine breath that has not yet been drawn, and there is something lovely about imagining even the mightiest gods as embryonic possibilities floating in the pre-dawn darkness of existence, not yet powerful enough to command temples and priesthoods, just becoming themselves in whatever mysterious way gods become themselves. The fringe interpretation I promised you for this section involves the theory, popular in certain alternative history circles, that the Sumerian gods represent not spiritual beings but actual extraterrestrial visitors, whose advanced technology seemed like divine power to the primitive humans who encountered them. And while this ancient astronaut hypothesis has been thoroughly debunked by mainstream archaeology, it persists in popular culture with remarkable tenacity, appearing in best-selling books and television programs and YouTube videos with millions of views, and there is something almost touching about the human desire to literalize mythology, to insist that gods must be either fictional characters or physical beings with spaceships and genetic engineering capabilities, as if the possibility of genuine spiritual reality is somehow less believable than aliens traveling across interstellar distances to play deity in ancient Mesopotamia, though I suspect the ancient Sumerians themselves would have found both interpretations equally strange, since for them the gods were simply the gods, neither fictional nor extraterrestrial but divine in a way that did not require further explanation. The scholarly debate I should mention here concerns the relationship between the Sumerian deities and the gods of later Mesopotamian civilizations, particularly the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, who inherited and transformed the Sumerian religious tradition over thousands of years, and researchers continue to argue about how much genuine continuity existed between these cultural phases, with some scholars emphasizing the fundamental similarities in theological structure, and others highlighting the significant differences in emphasis and interpretation. And the debate matters because it affects how we understand the Anunnaki themselves, who were a specifically Sumerian concept that was later adopted and modified by successor cultures, and whether the Babylonian Anunnaki were essentially the same divine beings as their Sumerian predecessors or represented a meaningful theological evolution, remains a question that generates conference papers and academic disagreement to this day. Let us return to the comfortable darkness of our story, where the first divine generations are slowly distinguishing themselves from the primordial chaos, and imagine how strange it must have been to be among the first beings ever to exist, without models or predecessors to guide you, without any prior experience of what existence involved, inventing consciousness and personality and relationship entirely from scratch. And if you think your Monday mornings are disorienting, imagine waking up for the first time ever, with no reference point for what waking up means, no coffee, no routine, no past to remember or future to anticipate, just the sudden shocking novelty of being something rather than nothing. Though presumably the gods did not experience their own emergence as shocking because they had nothing to compare it to. Perhaps for them the transition from non-existence to existence was as natural and unremarkable as your own transition from sleep to waking usually feels, which is an interesting parallel to contemplate as you drift in the opposite direction, from waking toward sleep, dissolving back into a personal darkness that might not be so different from the cosmic darkness where the gods first stirred. The concept that organizes these early divine generations in Sumerian theology is a term we might translate roughly as the Anunnaki, meaning something like princely offspring of heaven, or perhaps divine ones of noble seed. The translation varies depending on which scholar you ask and how they interpret the cuneiform components, but the essential meaning refers to the great gods as a collective, the assembled divine powers, who eventually come together to organize the cosmos and establish the order of things. And the crucial point for our purposes tonight is that the Anunnaki did not exist from the beginning. They emerged from earlier divine beings, who emerged from still earlier divine beings, who emerged from the primordial waters of Namu, which means there is always something before the thing you thought was first, always another layer of cosmic history beneath the layer you just uncovered, and this recursive quality makes Sumerian mythology particularly well suited for sleepy contemplation, because you can chase origins backward forever, without ever reaching a true beginning, each answer generating new questions in an infinite regress of why and what came before, and eventually, the mind simply gives up trying to reach solid ground, and allows itself to float in the mystery instead, which is honestly a more mature response to cosmological questions than demanding definitive answers that do not exist. The temple astronomers who observed the Mesopotamian sky and recorded the movements of planets and stars saw in those celestial patterns the visible expressions of divine activity, the gods moving across the heavens in their appointed courses. And this connection between astronomical observation and theological speculation is important because it means Sumerian religion was never purely abstract. It was grounded in the nightly experience of watching the sky, and you can imagine those ancient stargazers lying on the flat roofs of mud brick houses, perhaps not so differently from how you are lying now, gazing upward into darkness punctuated by points of light, and asking the same questions humans have always asked about where everything came from and what it all means. Questions that are still soothing to contemplate precisely because they have no final answers. They simply invite the mind to expand and wonder, and eventually tire itself out with wondering, which is exactly what we need right now, as we prepare to delve deeper into the cosmic dramas that preceded the establishment of earthly order. The genealogies recorded on clay tablets sometimes include divine beings, whose names we cannot confidently translate, gods whose functions and attributes remain mysterious, because the relevant explanatory texts have not survived or have not yet been discovered. And there is something appropriately humbling about this. All our scholarly efforts cannot fully illuminate these ancient religious systems because the evidence is fragmentary, scattered across museums and collections around the world, much of it still unread, because there are not enough trained cuneiformists to work through the backlog of untranslated tablets, and somewhere in storage rooms and archive boxes, there may be creation narratives we have never encountered, stories of primordial gods, whose names would change our understanding of everything, or perhaps just temple inventory lists and beer ration records. You never know until you read them, and I like to imagine some of those unread tablets contain bedtime stories too, tales told to Sumerian children 5,000 years ago to help them fall asleep, stories we might find eerily familiar if we could only decipher them, though for now they remain silent, keeping their secrets in the patient darkness of clay. The peaceful emergence of divine generations from primordial waters could not last forever, because existence is never content simply to be, it must become, and becoming involves change, and change involves conflict, and so the Sumerian creation narratives eventually arrive at cosmic struggle, at divine warfare, on a scale that makes human battles look like children squabbling over toys, though of course from the divine perspective human battles probably do look exactly like that, brief flurries of mortal activity that resolve themselves in what seems to the gods like a few blinks of an eternal eye. The great conflict that shapes the Mesopotamian cosmos involves the opposition between order and chaos, between structured existence and the formless void from which structure emerged, and this is not a conflict that can ever be permanently won, because chaos is always there at the foundations. The primordial waters never truly disappear, they are merely pushed back and contained, and the gods who establish cosmic order do so through constant effort and vigilance, maintaining boundaries that always threaten to dissolve, which makes the Sumerian universe feel considerably more precarious than the stable creation described in some other religious traditions, more like a house built on shifting sand that must be continually shored up, rather than a permanent structure that will stand forever without maintenance. The mainstream historical fact I should establish here is that the conflict narratives reached their most elaborate expression in the Babylonian Enuma Elish, composed perhaps around the 12th century BCE, but drawing on much older Sumerian traditions, and this epic poem describes how the god Marduk defeats the chaos monster Tiamat and creates the world from her corpse. And while Marduk is a specifically Babylonian deity who does not appear in the earlier Sumerian sources, the fundamental structure of the narrative, with cosmic order emerging from the defeat of primordial chaos, appears to reflect theological concepts that the Babylonians inherited from their Sumerian predecessors, and scholars like W.G. Lambert and John Bottero spent careers tracing these lines of cultural transmission, demonstrating how mythological themes evolved and transformed as they passed from one Mesopotamian civilization to the next, like whispers in a cosmic game of telephone spanning thousands of years. But let us go back before Marduk, before Babylon itself existed, to the Sumerian understanding of cosmic conflict, which presents a somewhat different picture than the later Babylonian synthesis. And in the earliest Sumerian texts, the great struggles involve not a single hero god defeating a chaos monster, but rather the collective action of the divine assembly, the Anunnaki working together to establish and maintain cosmic order. And this more collaborative model of divine governance says something interesting about Sumerian political culture, which valued consensus and council decisions in ways that the later empires, with their more centralized royal authority, would move away from. And so even in stories about gods, we can glimpse the social values of the humans who told those stories, which is perhaps not surprising, since gods are always, at least partly, reflections of the societies that worship them. The fringe interpretation that attaches to these conflict narratives involves the idea, promoted by certain alternative researchers, that the ancient Mesopotamian accounts of divine warfare might describe actual events, perhaps meteoric impacts or volcanic eruptions, or other natural catastrophes that were interpreted by surviving populations as battles between cosmic powers. And while this euhemeristic approach to mythology has a long scholarly history going back to the Greek philosopher Euhemerus himself, modern proponents sometimes take it in speculative directions that mainstream archaeologists find unconvincing, suggesting for instance that the defeat of Tiamat represents a specific astronomical event involving a collision in the early solar system. And while I present this interpretation with considerable skepticism, it does highlight how differently people can read the same ancient texts, some seeing purely symbolic spiritual narratives, and others seeing garbled accounts of physical phenomena. And the truth is probably that mythology operates on multiple levels simultaneously, encoding everything from cosmological speculation to political propaganda to genuine wonder at the mysteriousness of existence. And trying to reduce these complex cultural products to any single explanatory framework misses their essential richness. The scholarly debate surrounding the conflict narratives concerns how literally the ancient Mesopotamians understood their own mythology, a question that sounds simple, but turns out to be surprisingly difficult to answer, because the surviving texts do not come with authorial commentary explaining whether the stories should be taken as factual accounts of cosmic history, or as symbolic representations of philosophical concepts, or as something in between, and different scholars have argued for different positions, some suggesting that the educated priestly classes understood the mythology as allegory, while the common people believed it literally, others arguing that the distinction between literal and allegorical is itself a modern imposition that would not have made sense to ancient readers, and still others proposing that different texts had different relationships to belief, with some functioning more like entertainment and others more like sacred scripture, and the honest answer is that we do not really know how ancient Mesopotamians experienced their mythology, because they did not leave us records of their inner religious experiences, only the texts themselves, which can be interpreted in multiple ways. Picture now the cosmic struggle, as it might have appeared to a divine observer, the ordered realm of the gods surrounded by the dark waters of chaos that press in from every direction, above and below and around, the boundary between existence and void, maintained by the collective will of the Anunnaki, and imagine what it would feel like to be one of those gods, knowing that the nothingness from which you emerged is always just outside, always waiting for the moment when divine attention lapses and the boundaries weaken. And perhaps this is why the Mesopotamian gods seem to work so hard, maintaining temples and rituals and cosmic structures, because they understand in a way that humans often forget that order is not the natural state of things. Order is an achievement, a victory won against the default condition of formless chaos, and that victory must be won again and again in every moment, which is either a terrifying thought or a reassuring one, depending on how you look at it. Because if order requires constant effort, then it also means that effort matters, that what we do actually makes a difference in maintaining the structure of the world. Though admittedly this is a lot to ask of beings who just wanted to fall asleep listening to ancient mythology, so feel free to let the philosophical implications drift past without grabbing onto them too tightly. The separation of heaven and earth, which I mentioned earlier as a primordial event, also carries overtones of cosmic struggle in some versions of the Sumerian narratives, with the god Enlil performing the separation not as a gentle parting, but as a violent tearing apart, ripping the sky away from the land, so that there could be space between them, space for air and light, and life to exist. And this act of separation is sometimes described as the first moment of creation proper, the instant when the universe as we know it began, and it represents Enlil, establishing his domain of air and breath between the heaven of On above and the earth of Ki below, claiming the space between the cosmic parents for himself, which is either a heroic act of creation or a traumatic rupture in the primordial unity, depending on whether you emphasize the positive results or the violence of the separation. The struggle between order and chaos also plays out in the yearly agricultural cycle that dominated Sumerian life, with the annual flooding of the rivers representing a kind of controlled return of the primordial waters, a temporary victory of chaos that was necessary for the fertility of the fields, and the mythology reflects this ambivalent relationship with the forces of nature, recognizing that the same waters that could destroy cities and drown crops were also the source of all life and prosperity. And this is perhaps why Tiamat, the chaos monster of the Babylonian version, is portrayed not as purely evil, but as an angry mother goddess, whose destruction creates the world, her death being simultaneously a tragedy and a necessity. And there is something very mature about mythology that can hold both of these truths together without choosing between them, acknowledging that creation often involves destruction, and that the forces we fear are also the forces that sustain us. Lying here in the darkness, you might find it strangely comforting to remember that the ancient Mesopotamians also lay in darkness, thinking about these things, that the same stars visible from your window were visible from their rooftops, that the same fundamental questions about existence and order and meaning troubled their nights as well as ours, and that the stories they invented to grapple with these questions are still capable of providing a kind of companionship across the millennia, the voices of long-dead scribes reaching through time to whisper their wondering to anyone who will listen. And if that is not a small victory against chaos, a moment of order and connection established in the void, then I do not know what is. The divine assembly where the Anunnaki gathered to make cosmic decisions appears in numerous Sumerian texts as a fundamental institution of divine governance, a celestial court where matters of cosmic import were debated and decreed, and this image of the gods sitting in council reflects the actual political practices of Sumerian city-states, where assemblies of elders and citizens made important decisions collectively rather than deferring entirely to royal authority, and so the mythological structure mirrors the social structure, or perhaps the social structure mirrors the mythological one, or more likely they develop together in complex interrelation, each shaping and being shaped by the other in ways that are now impossible to fully disentangle, though the effort of disentangling them keeps academic departments funded, which is a small but meaningful contribution to contemporary civilization. As sleep begins to pull at your awareness, perhaps the cosmic struggles we have discussed start to feel less like distant mythology and more like something immediate and personal, because each night when you surrender to unconsciousness, you too are letting go of order, releasing the structured awareness that defines your waking self, allowing formless darkness to wash over you like primordial waters. And each morning when you wake, you recapitulate the cosmic creation, establishing light and order and identity all over again. And in this sense, you are not just hearing a story about divine conflict, but participating in an ongoing struggle between being and not being that is as old as consciousness itself. Now we arrive at the formation of our world, the specific moment when the cosmic struggles of divine beings resulted in something solid enough to stand on, something real enough to call Earth. And this is where the Sumerian narratives become particularly vivid and strange, describing the creation of land and sky, and living things in terms that combine the familiar and the utterly alien, in ways that keep scholars debating their precise meanings after more than a century of serious study. The mainstream Sumerian historical fact that anchors this section is that the Sumerians understood their land, the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, as having been literally created by the rivers themselves, built up over countless generations from silt deposited by annual floods. And this geological awareness informed their mythology in interesting ways, because unlike peoples who lived on ancient mountains or stable continents, the Sumerians knew that their land was relatively new, that it emerged from water in a process that was still ongoing. And so the mythological account of Earth emerging from primordial waters was not just a symbolic story, but a description of something they could actually observe happening, the rivers constantly extending the coastline of southern Mesopotamia into the Persian Gulf, creating new land from the marriage of water and sediment. And this connection between mythology and observable reality gives Sumerian creation narratives a particular concreteness that distinguishes them from more purely abstract cosmogonies. The formation of the Earth in Sumerian mythology is not a single event but a process that unfolds across time, beginning with the separation of heaven and earth that I described earlier, and continuing through the organization of the world into its proper divisions, with the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, called Abzu, providing the water that feeds rivers and springs, and the saltwater ocean surrounding the earth, providing the boundary between the ordered world and the chaos beyond, and the sky above providing a dome or ceiling that holds back the celestial waters and supports the heavenly bodies in their courses. And this cosmological architecture may seem naive from our modern perspective, but it was a sophisticated attempt to systematize observable phenomena into a coherent worldview. And honestly, the Sumerian model of the universe is no more arbitrary than any other prescientific cosmology, including several that persisted in European thought well into the modern era. The fringe interpretation that attaches to these Earth formation narratives involves the persistent claim, popular among ancient astronaut enthusiasts, that the Sumerian description of the world being formed from the body of a slain deity might encode knowledge of planetary formation, perhaps derived from extraterrestrial visitors, who explain to primitive humans how planets form from the debris of stellar collisions or the accretion of cosmic material. And while this interpretation requires considerable interpretive gymnastics and is not taken seriously by mainstream scholars, it does highlight the genuinely impressive sophistication of Mesopotamian cosmological thinking, which grappled with questions about the origin and structure of the physical world that remain challenging even today. Though obviously the answers we have developed through modern science are considerably more reliable than ancient astronaut theories, however entertaining those theories might be as late-night speculation. The scholarly debate I should mention here concerns the relationship between Sumerian cosmology and Sumerian mathematics, because the same culture that developed these creation narratives also developed a base 60 numerical system that we still use today for measuring time and angles. And some researchers have argued that the mathematical sophistication of the Sumerians influenced their cosmological thinking, leading them to imagine the universe in terms of precise geometric relationships and numerical ratios, while others contend that the mythology and the mathematics developed relatively independently and should not be conflated. And this debate matters because it affects how we understand the overall intellectual culture of ancient Mesopotamia, whether we see them as proto-scientists, whose myths encode empirical observations and mathematical relationships, or as a fundamentally different kind of society whose myths served purposes that we cannot easily translate into modern scientific categories. After the physical world was formed, it remained empty and silent, a stage without actors, and so the next phase of creation involved populating that stage with living things. And here the Sumerian narratives offer some of their most fascinating and disturbing material, because the creation of humanity in these stories is not an act of divine love or cosmic purpose, but a solution to a practical problem. The gods were tired of doing their own work, and needed servants to feed them and maintain their temples and perform the endless labor that keeps a complex civilization running. And so humans were created as divine slaves, shaped from clay and animated with divine breath, specifically to relieve the gods of tedious responsibilities, which is perhaps not the most flattering origin story, but does have the virtue of explaining why life so often feels like work. The specific text that describes human creation in greatest detail is the Atrahasis epic, which survives in Babylonian copies but draws on earlier Sumerian traditions, and in this narrative, the lesser gods have been laboring to maintain the cosmic order, and they grow tired and rebellious, eventually staging a strike and refusing to continue working, and the great gods respond by creating humans to take over the labor, mixing clay with the blood of a slain deity to create beings capable of work and worship, and this origin from divine blood explains why humans have a spark of the divine in them, while remaining fundamentally mortal and earthbound. We are neither fully gods nor fully animals, but something in between, shaped to serve purposes we did not choose, and if that sounds depressing, you can take comfort in the fact that the Sumerians also believed humans could find meaning and pleasure in their brief lives, despite, or perhaps because of, their subordinate cosmic status. Picture the moment of human creation as the Sumerians imagined it. The birth goddess Ninhursag, kneading clay in a divine workshop, mixing it with water and blood, shaping the first human forms with her skilled fingers, and then those clay figures slowly warming into life, opening their eyes for the first time to see a world already ancient, already organized, already waiting for them to begin the work for which they were designed. And there is something moving about this image, even if it lacks the cosmic dignity of creation narratives that present humans as the crown of creation rather than its maintenance staff, because at least in this version we matter. We have a purpose. The gods actually need us, even if they need us mostly to clean up after them and bring them offerings, and that is more than the uncaring universe of modern cosmology offers, where we emerged by chance from chemical processes that had no intentions whatsoever. The Earth that emerged from these cosmic processes was understood by the Sumerians to be flat and roughly circular, surrounded by water, covered by the dome of heaven, and filled with the spirit of the gods, every river and field and city charged with divine presence, and this enchanted worldview is perhaps what we have lost most completely in our modern understanding. The sense that the physical world is alive with meaning, that every stone and tree and cloud participates in cosmic dramas that extend far beyond human concerns, and while we cannot return to the literal beliefs of the ancient Mesopotamians, there is something valuable in remembering that other ways of experiencing the world are possible, that the flat gray landscape of materialist metaphysics is not the only option, and that the universe might be more mysterious and meaningful than our current frameworks suggest, though these are perhaps thoughts better suited to the edges of sleep than to serious philosophical debate. The organization of human society mirrored the organization of the cosmos in Sumerian thought, with the king serving as the representative of the gods on earth, the temples serving as the earthly homes of divine powers, and the rituals of worship serving to maintain the proper relationship between the human and divine realms. And this interpenetration of mythology and social structure meant that the creation narratives were not just stories about the distant past, but living frameworks that shaped everyday life, explaining why society was organized the way it was, and why people owed obedience to kings and priests and gods. And in this sense, Sumerian mythology was never merely decorative or entertaining, it was the conceptual foundation of an entire civilization, the deep grammar that made social life intelligible and meaningful. As the Anunnaki assembled in their celestial council to oversee the world they had created, assigning fates and issuing decrees and occasionally intervening in human affairs, they established a cosmic order that would persist for thousands of years in Mesopotamian religious tradition, modified and adapted by successive cultures but fundamentally continuous, and this is the order that existed before the disruptions of recorded history, before the rise and fall of empires, before the personal dramas and political conflicts that fill the surviving tablets with accounts of wars and treaties and royal achievements, and understanding what existed before the Anunnaki helps us understand what the Anunnaki themselves represented, which was not the origin of things but the organization of things, the divine power that shaped formless chaos into ordered cosmos and continues to maintain that order against the ever-present threat of dissolution, a task in which humans participate through our work and worship and our simple persistence in being alive, despite everything that would prefer us not to be. The image of the world resting on primordial waters, surrounded by chaos, maintained by divine effort, and populated by beings designed for service, may seem strange from our modern vantage point, but it was a coherent and functional worldview that sustained one of humanity's first great civilizations through more than 2,000 years of cultural development, and the fragments of that worldview that survive in clay tablets and archaeological remains continue to reward careful study, offering glimpses of how differently humans have understood their place in the cosmos and how much we share despite those differences, the same basic questions and fears and hopes manifesting in different symbolic forms across the millennia. Now, as our journey through the primordial ages draws to its close, we find ourselves returning from the cosmic depths to the gentle present moment, from the vast timescales of divine creation to the small, comfortable space where you lie listening, and the transition feels somehow natural because the stories we have explored were always meant to bridge exactly this gap, connecting mortal awareness to eternal mysteries, helping fragile human minds touch something larger than themselves before releasing into the restorative darkness of sleep. We have traveled together through the formless waters of Namu, the primordial ocean that existed before existence had a name, and we have watched the first divine beings emerge from that endless sea, and Enki and Enlil, and all the others who would eventually constitute the assembly of the Anunnaki, and we have witnessed the cosmic struggles that separated heaven from earth and order from chaos, and we have seen our own world take shape from the debris of divine conflict, populated at last by humanity, those clay creatures animated by divine blood and designed to serve purposes we did not choose but might still find meaningful. The Sumerians who first told these stories are long gone, their cities buried under Iraqi sands, their language silent except in the mouths of scholars who reconstruct its sounds from ancient phonetic guides, and yet something of their wondering persists, something of their attempt to understand the incomprehensible reaches across 5,000 years to touch you tonight. And if that connection does not qualify as a small miracle, then perhaps our definition of miracle is too narrow. What existed before the Anunnaki, according to Sumerian records, was not nothing but rather everything in potential form, the infinite possibility that had not yet chosen to become anything specific, and this understanding feels surprisingly relevant to the experience of falling asleep, because as your conscious mind releases its grip on specific thoughts and identities, you too return to a state of undifferentiated potential, a personal darkness full of dreams waiting to take shape, and the boundary between your private unconscious and the cosmic unconscious that the Sumerians called Namu becomes, for a moment, permeable. Thank you for spending this time with me among the oldest stories humanity has preserved, and if you have enjoyed the journey, I hope you will consider subscribing to join me for future explorations of history's forgotten corners. Though there is no obligation, only invitation, and the invitation stands whether you subscribe or not, because these stories belong to everyone and should be shared freely. The clay tablets that preserve these narratives through millennia of war and empire and decay are remarkable technologies when you think about them. Simple mud impressed with simple marks and baked in simple ovens, yet capable of carrying meaning across gulfs of time that would swallow any modern storage medium, and there is something reassuring about that durability, the knowledge that important things can persist if we take care to preserve them, and that the effort of preservation is itself a kind of resistance against the entropy that would prefer everything to dissolve back into chaos. Let your breathing slow now. Let your thoughts drift like clouds across a Mesopotamian sky. Let the ancient waters of Namu rise gently to receive you, and know that in surrendering to sleep, you participate in the oldest rhythm of existence, the alternation of order and dissolution that has structured the cosmos since before the gods themselves were born, and that when you wake tomorrow, you will recapitulate creation, establishing light and structure and identity once again in the personal universe of your consciousness, joining the endless work of maintaining order against chaos that the Anunnaki began so long ago. Sleep well, dream deep, and may the primordial waters carry you safely through the night to whatever morning awaits. Good night.